It's a really great pleasure to be able to introduce to you for this lecture Professor Ed Larson. At present, Ed has two chairs at Pepperdine University. He's a university professor of history there. He also has a named chair, the Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair of Law. So he brings with him a very interesting combination of talents. Ed, of a dozen books that he has published, let me just mention a few. Perhaps the one that most of you will know is his book on the Scopes Trial, Summer for the Gods, the Scopes Trial and America's Continuing Debate Over Science and Religion. It came out, I think, in 97. Is that right, Ed? And then in 1998 it won the Pulitzer Prize. So Ed, I think, is typically introduced as the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Ed Larson, and why not? Relevant to Ed's topic today, a book before this, I think, on eugenics in the South, in the US, that came out in 1995. Another one that I think is a terrific read and worth... I don't think it's at the bookshop because we seem to have mostly OUP things there. But Evolution's Workshop, God and Science on the Galapagos Islands, that came out with basic books in 2001. And most recently, a terrific read on the Antarctic expeditions and the race between, Scott and Munsden, Shackleton and the gang, called it An Empire of Ice, I think An Empire of Ice. From Yale University Press, it's come out this year. I think it's just available in the UK now, and it's been available in the US for some time. So, very much looking forward to Ed's talk today, which is entitled Who is to Blame for Eugenics, an English Agnostic or an Austrian Abbot. So please join with me in welcoming Ed.
Well, it's truly a delight to be here. Thank you so much to all the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful place, this wonderful setting, this great college and great university. We know, thank you for that introduction, we know from Revelation that prophets are not honored in their homeland. But now we know from reason and experience that historians, the opposite of prophets, historians are honored in their homeland because Peter, of course, has been taken back to his native land from here at Oxford to one of the finest chairs and special chairs. So that's a special honor that he so greatly, greatly deserves. I guess when you think about it, you'd have to sort of reason that one small university's loss is one great continent's gain. Now, that covers historians and prophets. I don't know quite what we say about philosophers, where they're honored. We don't have enough evidence yet, but from the introduction Michael received yesterday by Ron Numbers, I would say, at the very least, philosophers are honored in Arkansas. And as further evidence of that, I suppose that before Michael went there, I remember as a child that the license plates from Arkansas used to read Land of Opportunity, which of course it was for him. But now they read, since he's been there, they now read Diamonds Fell in Arkansas. And I guess this is our diamond in the rough right here. So that's the honor we have here. And it was a wonderful, thank you for your talk yesterday and for Ron Numbers' talk. He's another historian who's honored, I found out last month, was honored in his homeland. I went out for the first time to speak at his home university, Loma Linda, which is sort of the Utah for Seventh-day Adventists. And I found out that everyone spoke so highly of him and with such great praise, he has clearly become the Seventh-day Adventists' favorite apostate. So it was a real treat. In this conference on the evolution of morality and the morality of evolution, I've been asked to address the title's second half by discussing the scientific roots of eugenics. Hence my title, Who's to Blame for Eugenics? An English Agnostic or an Austrian Abbot. Peter asked me to address this topic for us, and I'm delighted to do so. Eugenics, of course, was the practice that gained currency during the early 20th century, about 100 years ago, but is now widely discredited, of improving human population through selective breeding. I suppose, speaking as I am in the shadow of Ascot, I should note that eugenicists at the time liked to compare what they wanted to do to humans to the breeding of thoroughbred racehorses. Well, if it is true, and that was asked for my topic, if it is true that a picture is worth 10,000 words, and my talk was supposed to be that long, then here's my talk. I can just sit down. This is how eugenicists pictured the roots of their discipline in a poster at the Second International Congress of Eugenics in 1921. Note, if you look at it, note that the two largest taproots of the eugenics tree are genetics and statistics. And that evolutionary biology is not even listed down there. Instead, eugenics itself is defined as, quote, the self-direction of human evolution. So in that sense, I would say that Darwinism is presented in this image not as the root for eugenics, but rather as part of the identity of eugenics, its very identity. Now, as odd as this may sound, I think this image is worth pursuing, and that's what I'll do in this talk. By all accounts, the father of eugenics was not Charles Darwin. It was his first cousin, Francis Galton. The difference is critical, because while Darwin may be the father of the theory of evolution by natural selection, Galton is the father figure in both genetics and in statistics, which, of course, here are identified as the two scientific roots shown in this picture of the roots of eugenics. So let's pick up this story with Galton. I know it's a little blurry, but I wanted to use this image of Galton in particular because it's one I took. This Galton, if you what did Stephen Jay Gould call them? Spandrels? Was that it? Spandrels? This is there in the corner of one of the archways to one of the great buildings at the University of Chicago, which of course was one of the centers of genetics research in the early 20th century in America. And here on the archway, holding up the great arch as you go in, is a picture, is the carving of Francis Galton. Now, I guess to put it succinctly, Galton believed that some people are born smart, others are born stupid, and the source of all such hereditary traits reach deep into one's ancestry. He came to these beliefs from personal experience, his class and racial identity, the inspiration of the selectionist theories of his cousin Charles, and what he viewed as his own hereditary genius. One of the last major English gentleman scientists without institutional affiliation, Galton developed his hereditarian notions to such a degree that they helped to lay the foundation for both genetics and eugenics, which in their formative period were allied, overlapping sciences. During the late 1800s, most naturalists, including Charles Darwin, accepted a blending view of inheritance whereby offspring manifested a middling mix of their parents' traits. In the tradition of French evolutionist Lamarck, many of them also maintain that at least some characteristics acquired by an individual during their lives passed on to their descendants. Darwin came to regard acquired characteristics and other environmentally induced alterations in a parent's hereditary material, which he called gamules. I think that's the way it's pronounced, gamules. He became to view this as a major source for inheritable variations that fueled evolution. Now, Galton's key insight, in contrast to his cousin Charles, was the concept of hard heredity, or heredity that cannot change during one's lifetime, as opposed to the soft heredity of inheritable acquired characteristics. This became, as time wore on in their life, as an increasingly major difference between Galton and Darwin. And why Darwin never really became a eugenicist, even though, as was pointed out, some of his writings reflected some sympathy with some of those ideas. In his earliest published work on heredity, Galton rhetorically asked the question, will our children be born with more virtuous habits if we ourselves have acquired virtuous habits? Or are we no more than passive transmitters of a nature we have received and which we have no power to modify? It was a rhetorical question to which he gave the answers. No was the answer to the first part of it, and yes was the right answer to the second one. And this is his own chart of inheritance of ability, notice, the Darwin, Galton, and Wedgwood family trees as they blended together. Seeing a material basis for this hereditary information, Galton commandeered Darwin's theory of gamules and turned it to his own ends. For Darwin, gamules represented invisibly small bits of hereditary information collected from every part of both parents and transmitted during reproduction to their offsprings. New hereditary variations could come from environmentally caused changes in gamules as thrown off by the parents or received by their offspring. Darwin did not conceive, therefore, this hereditary information as fixed throughout a parent's life, but could change along with the individual. Galton, in contrast, accepted the basic notion of these particle hereditary bits, which he called germs, but unlike Darwin, maintained that they remained distinct from the body. We are passive transmitters, and these hereditary bits guide its development, the development of the individual, but are never impacted by it. In reproduction, unmodified germs from both parents combine to compose the germs of their offspring. As long as no new hereditary information enters the equation, then, such as by acquired characteristics which he rejected, or by spontaneous mutations at conception which he accepted, Galton asserted that normal, continuous variations in the population cannot lead to generational change. And to prove his point, he did revolutionary work that we still suffer from when we go through science. He did revolutionary work in statistics, came up with many of the foundational ideas of statistics to prove his point, to show how this worked, to show how this continuous variation of the population cannot lead to generational change. He calculated, and here's one of his distribution charts. He calculated that successive generations descending from even the most gifted individuals will naturally regress to its species or racial norm. Sustained selection for the same trait in both parents, such as can result from environmental pressure or eugenic mating, can slow the regression. But Galton purported to prove that even it cannot permanently alter species or racial norms. Only discontinuous variations in the form of gross inborn mutations can overcome the limits of ancestral inheritance and evolve new species or races. Well, during the late 1800s and early 1900s, various scientists pursued Galton's insights in different directions. In Germany, for example, the cytologist August Weismann soon took up the cause of hard heredity, at first independently from Galton's work, but increasingly with reference to it. Weismann called the hereditary material germplasm, which quickly became its favored name, and localized it on chromosomes in the cell nucleus. But it was conceptually similar to Galton's germs and equally as immutable during an individual's lifetime. In Britain, mathematician Carl Pearson and marine zoologist W.F.R. Welton carried on Galton's statistical analysis of the built-up, added-on cumulative impact over time of normal continuous variation within populations, a field of study they called biometry. Although Pearson and Weldon did not win many converts, by 1900 they had demonstrated to their own satisfaction that Galton was wrong on one point. Sustained selection of normal continuous variations could indeed permanently shift the species norm in the selected for direction. Concurrently, Galton's other principal disciple, morphologist William Bateson, here shown with carrying around ducks and trying to compare their similarities, championed the role of gross mutations in fueling the evolutionary process and defended the position that normal, continuous variations lead nowhere. Although Pearson and Bateson clashed mightily over whether continuous or discontinuous variation fed evolution, both upheld Galton's position on hard heredity and were committed eugenicists. By 1900, Bateson was far from alone in accepting the so-called mutation theory of evolution. Disillusioned by the lack of solid experimental evidence for either normal continuous variation spawning new species or the inheritance of acquired characteristics, an increasing number of late 19th century biologists turned to mutation theory for answers, with Dutch botanist Hugo de Vries finding encouraging results in his study of the evening primrose, and this is one of his images of the pair, which seemed to mutate randomly and regularly. American zoologist Thomas Hunt Morgan soon joined the search for mutations in his work with fruit flies. Despite their disagreements on the means of evolution, by 1900, all three proto-geneticists, Weismann, Pearson, Weldon, and, I should add, all of them, Bateson, de Vries, and Morgan, explicitly or implicitly embraced eugenics. None of them got there through Darwinism alone, however. It also took a belief in hard heredity, which Darwin didn't have. Yet, the selectionist emphasis of late 19th century evolutionary thought did help create an environment where eugenics took root. A further scientific factor also held back the flowering of eugenics. Most late 19th century biological and social scientists, including Darwin and Galton, subscribed to a blending view of heredity, as I've already noted, under which children inherited a blend of their parents' or other ancestors' traits. Under this view, as Galton demonstrated with regression analysis, the challenge lay not so much in pulling inferior families up to the special or racial norm, because that should happen naturally through crossbreeding, but rather the problem lay in keeping superior families from falling back toward that special norm. Thus, Galton, in his work, stressed more breeding by the fit, discouraging reproduction by the unfit, which later became the central thrust of the eugenics movement, did not initially appear quite so crucial to him. In 1900, however, the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's work with pea plants suggested that parental and other ancestral traits reappear in children and more remote descendants without blending. From its rediscovery, mutation theorists embraced Mendelianism as showing how discontinuous variations are propagated. They found the classical school of modern genetics and soon began calling themselves geneticists. During the 1920s and early 1930s, geneticist R.A. Fisher and J.B.S. Haldane in Britain and Sewell Wright in America demonstrated mathematically, and this he's working on his little calculator there, as R.A. Fisher was very good at doing. He was a mathematical whiz, just an amazing mathematical mind, as Galton had too. I mean, they both had this incredible facility with mathematics that led them to be transformative scientists. Well, he demonstrated all three of them actually, demonstrated mathematically how Mendelian processes could also account for evolution of new species through normal, seemingly continuous variation that come from birth. Through their work, biometricians and mutation theorists united under the banner of population genetics to rout ideas of soft and blended heredity from science. For many, including Fisher, Haldane, and Wright, this made the case for eugenics. If there are superior and inferior hereditary traits, they reasoned, and if the impact of those traits on succeeding generations is unalterable by environmental influences or by blending, then eugenics must be true, at least if the genes carrying those traits operated as simple Mendelian factors. Indeed, Fisher bent his mind to genetics in the first place, even as an undergraduate at Cambridge, to prove this very point, and thereby encourage the propagations of a better breed of Britons. Now, more children from the fit and less from the unfit became the motto for a new generation of eugenicists. Of course, the triumph of eugenics built on a history of greater public acceptance of both hereditarianism in general and of a competitive struggle for existence as a driving force for social and economic progress. It only took a slight twist of reasoning to transpose accepting the natural selection of the fit into encouraging the intentional elimination of the unfit. Even though eugenics was born in Britain, methods for its coercive application principally developed first in the United States. Eugenicists who were instinctively elitist, could almost be their definition, never placed as much hope in education to discourage dysgenic unions as they did in using education to encourage eugenic ones. Instead, they turned to three different methods of legal restriction: marriage laws, sexual segregation, and involuntary sterilization. In the United States, these methods required the enactment and enforcement of legislative programs by the states, which became the primary legal objective of the American eugenics movement during the early 20th century. And this chart shows their success, the various states that adopted eugenical sterilization statutes and when they did so. Typically, these methods, these three methods, restrictive marriage laws, eugenic marriage laws, sexual segregation in institutions, and involuntary sterilization, built on each other as a series of overlapping and increasingly intrusive steps toward achieving national eugenic improvement. Due to various cultural, social, and political factors, California became the center for involuntary sterilization in America during the first half of the 20th century. In 1909, it passed the nation's second compulsory sterilization law, and in 1917 revised it to cover any patient at a state mental health institution, and I'm quoting here, who is afflicted with mental disease that may have been inherited and is likely to be transmitted to descendants, or who suffers from one of various grades of mental retardation. Another provision in this law reached, and again I'm quoting, all those suffering from perversion or marked departure from normal mentality or from disease of a syphilitic nature. Under the law, the procedure occurred prior to a patient's release from custody and did not require consent. Reaching beyond institutional walls, the law also directed state mental health hospitals to perform outpatient sterilizations without charge on any idiot upon the written request of a parent or guardian. The law did not require that the operation benefit the patient. Social benefit alone sufficed. By 1950, approximately 20,000 institutionalized persons and many more outpatients had been sterilized under the California law, which represented 3 times the number of compulsory sterilizations as in any other state and nearly 1/3 of the national total in the United States. American geneticists uniformly supported eugenics and were the backbone of the movement during its formative years, as did many, probably most, though we can't run the numbers, or I haven't been able to, as did most American psychologists, sociologists, social workers, physicians, cultural geographers, and anthropologists. Their professional associations generally followed suit, most notably the American Genetics Association. And virtually all state and national medical societies did so as well. A few elite philanthropists and foundations provided most of the movement's financial backing, particularly the Carnegie Institute, the widow of railroad magnate E.H. Harriman, California financier E.S. Gosney, and the Rockefeller Foundation. In some ways, American eugenics became a model for other countries. Most Canadian provinces followed their U.S. counterparts in the United States in enacting eugenic restrictions on reproduction, as did some Australian states. Beginning with the passage of Germany's law for the prevention of genetically diseased progeny in 1933, and here is a picture, by the way, of Cold Harbor Springs, which was the American Research Institute, where was the center of it, center of the research that was funded by the Carnegie Institute. And then we'll go to the German poster. There it is. The German law, passed in 1933, was modeled in part on California's compulsory sterilization law. Following that act by Germany, every Nordic nation in Europe adopted stern eugenics legislation. A scattering of Eastern European, Asian, and Latin American nations did as well, as did some British colonies, though not the United Kingdom itself. Germany's 1933 law, which was the most far-reaching such statute enacted anywhere, mandated the sterilizations of persons determined by genetic health courts to suffer from congenital feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, manic depression, severe physical deformity, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's cholera, hereditary blindness or deafness, or severe alcoholism. Quote, "We must see to it that these inferior people do not procreate," the noted German geneticist Erwin Bahr, there he is, looking at a flower, asserted at the time. Quote, "No one approves of the new sterilization laws more than I do, but I must repeat over and over that they constitute only a beginning." Might qualify as one of those prophets. Some 300,000 persons were sterilized under this law between 1933 and 1939, when it was replaced by a euthanasia program designed to rid the fatherland, then engaged in a costly world war, of its mentally handicapped children. Virtually the entire German genetics community, which was one of the largest and finest in the world, joined Bauer in supporting eugenic sterilization and other Nazi efforts to expand eugenics research and application. Even before the Nazis took power, such renowned German geneticists as Bauer, Fritz Lenz, and Hermann Muckermann, a Catholic lay leader and former priest, worked notions of Nordic racial superiority into their eugenics. Adolf Hitler read their writings during his rise, and once in power, his party sought support from genetics for its policies. German geneticists freely gave it. They joined the party, according to statistics, they joined the party in numbers disproportionate to other professions, and turned research at the prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, shown here with a Nazi flag on it, toward Nazi ends. In return, geneticists received generous support from the state and a free flow of involuntary human subjects, which they used in cutting-edge but morally bankrupt research. In her 2010 book, historian Sheila Faith Weiss termed it a Faustian bargain that led to a symbiotic relationship between German geneticists and the Third Reich. Now, eugenics lost favor almost as quickly as it had gained favor. In reality, it never really attracted widespread public following. Even in its heyday, British essayist G.K. Chesterton dismissed eugenics as a mean-spirited elitist joke that briefly, as in his words, turned from a fad into a fashion. Yet it did not encounter much organized opposition, so that a highly motivated eugenics clique could carry the day in some places, at least for a while. Indeed, when you read the studies of this, but other things in history, one finds that I just am amazed what one or a few people can do, either for good or for ill, if they are determined and appear very confident. Only the Catholic Church offered sustained, organized opposition to eugenics, doing so largely on religious rather than scientific grounds, and, frankly, when doing so, it did not sound very confident. But even it did not do so in Germany, where the Catholic Party had supported sterilization laws prior to the Nazi takeover. Indeed, only in Germany did eugenics gain sufficient depth of support to overcome truly committed opponents. Within the British Parliament, for example, one highly critical backbencher, Darwin's distant cousin, Josiah Wedgwood, almost single-handedly is credited with stalling passage of eugenics sterilization legislatures sponsored by his own Liberal Party government in 1912 and 1913. His efforts within Parliament were effective in part because many prominent British eugenicists, including Pearson and Bateson, openly questioned the wisdom of coercive sterilization programs. Well, the tide of popular opinion began turning against eugenics and social Darwinism, when that term was coined, actually, and when it got its pejorative connotations by the 1930s. A new breed of social scientists, led by American anthropologists Franz Boas and Margaret Mead, challenged the hereditarian assumptions underlying eugenics. And for that, I do like to go back to, remember my earlier picture that I tried so hard to get a little blurry one of Galton at the University of Chicago holding up one wing of an archway? Well, if one sees the other wing of the archways, well, who's there but Franz Boas holding up the other wing of the archway, which I find absolutely fascinating. The worldwide economic depression that started during the late 1920s and persisted through the 1930s caused many people to question the simple equation of hereditary fitness with social or economic success. The exposure of racist, ethnic, and religious uses of eugenics by the Nazi government in Germany pretty much settled the matter. In the face of heightened public skepticism of eugenic claims, some left-leaning geneticists in America and in Britain took this opportunity to try to purge the movement of what they perceived as racial and class bias. That imbeciles should be sterilized is, of course, unquestionable, the Marxist geneticist Hermann J. Mueller told the Third International Congress of Eugenics in 1932, and there he is, looking very closely at something. But he warned at the same time that economic inequality could mask genetic qualities. At the time, Mueller was one of America's leading geneticists and a future Nobel laureate. By 1935, he had moved to the Soviet Union and was urging its government to implement a eugenics program that would inseminate superior women with sperm from men of extreme intelligence, talent, and social feeling, such as himself. Indeed, he made the supreme sacrifice for science, be willing to offer his own sperm for the program. What a generous man. Within a century, Mueller claimed, most people could, and I quote from him because I couldn't say it myself, Most people could have the innate qualities of such men as Lenin, Newton, Leonardo, Pasteur, Beethoven, Omar Khayyam, Pushkin, set his son Marx, or even to possess their varied faculties combined. Now, that would be some character, especially if picked up the worst traits of each of those people. As I'd see it, a neurotic, reclusive, deaf, manic depressive, mass murderer. We sure need more of those. Here was Galton's dream, with the class and race prejudice attributed to so-called mainline eugenicists replaced with Mueller's reformed ones. Now, few could match Mueller's ardor for the cause, but many progressively minded geneticists and physicians took a similar tact. In Britain, a person we've heard a lot about, Julian Huxley, and others like J.B.S. Haldane and Lancelot Hogben, joined in the call for purging eugenics of its reactionary biases to save it from its own excesses. For them, voluntary sterilization offered a better promise than compulsory schemes. Back in the United States, the reform position appeared in a 1932 report from a blue ribbon committee of the American Neurological Association, specially chosen for their expertise, and chaired by Boston psychiatrist Abraham Myerson. There he is with the group. While the report roundly condemned state-ordered sterilization on account of choosing your subjects for state oral sterilization on the grounds of their social characteristics or the fact where they were criminals, where they had been convicted of crimes, or a variety of other character defects. It nevertheless, and I'm quoting here, recommended sterilization in select cases of certain diseases and with the consent of the patient or, and this is critical, or those responsible for him, which would mean the institution or the parent or guardian. Those diseases that should be sterilized included mental hereditary retardation, schizophrenia, manic depressive, and epilepsy. Comparing the programs offered by the two groups, political scientist Diane Paul concludes the distinction between reformed and mainline eugenics should not be overdrawn. The public seemed to agree. Reform or no, eugenics steadily lost credibility during the 1930s and 40s. Following World War II, philanthropists who were still interested in such matters, such as the Rockefeller Foundation, shifted their support from eugenic sterilization programs at home to elitist population control efforts in developing countries. Most geneticists also backed away from their earlier claims for eugenics, particularly as they increasingly realized that most behavioral and mental traits involved such a complex interaction of multiple genes that they could not be addressed by simple eugenic remedies. Those who did not, like R.A. Fisher, lost public prestige and professional posts. By mid-century, nurture had supplanted nature as the accepted explanation for how people behave. So, who or what is to blame for eugenics? Certainly it is not simply the theory of evolution, despite this poster sort of morphing Hitler into Darwin, or Darwin into Hitler. It's because the theory of evolution can invoke mechanisms that are simply, totally, and completely opposed to eugenics. The Darwinian emphasis on selection as an engine of evolution presumably contributed to a social environment that was conducive to eugenics, but such social thinking was growing before Darwin published his theory, and by itself was not sufficient to sustain eugenic practices. In science, it took the rejection of a belief in both blended heredity and the inheritance of acquired characteristics for eugenics to gain widespread support. And this lasted only until geneticists realized that genetics did not operate as simply in human and on human behavior as it did on pea plants and the color and size and wrinkleness of peas. Yet Darwin never rejected either of these key doctrines, that is, blended inheritance or the inheritance of acquired characteristics. It did take an English agnostic and an Austrian abbot to lay the scientific foundations for eugenics. But that English agnostic was Francis Galton, not Darwin. And neither he nor the Austrian abbot, Gregor Mendel, ever imagined how their ideas would be used by the Nazis or even by the Californians. Thank you. Now, I have plenty of time for questions, but as illustration, rather than leaving Francis Galton up there, I'll show that this is not the only image of Darwin and Mervyn Hitler. At my home university, the University of Georgia, we have a statue with me in front of it, which shows Darwin morphing into God. That's a statue in front of the science building at University of Georgia with me in front, and you can see Darwin's on one side and God's on the other. So he could look like quite a few different things, and people can view his morphing in many different ways.
Which one is that?
Which one's God? Which one's God?
I'm in the front. Darwin is on the statue has Darwin on this side and God on the other, and it's God and Darwin is the name of the statue, and it's at the University of Georgia.
There you go. Thanks, Ed. Well, folks, we've got at least 15 minutes for questions. So who wants to kick off? And if you can just wait for the microphone to get to you. Yes, right here.
Hi. Can I make a comment and then ask a question?
Yes.
The comment is about the excruciating Professor Müller. That yes, he did write that book in 1935. He made a huge mistake. He sent a signed copy of it to Stalin, who was horrified.
Who didn't like it?
Who didn't like it?
But see, he hadn't named Stalin. He named Lenin, and by this time, Stalin didn't like Lenin.
No, but he.
No, but you're right. You're absolutely
officially,
right.
eugenics
You're
had
absolutely
been
right.
banned, between
you're
1931 and 32.
Yes.
But and then he had to light out of there really quickly.
You're right.
But the question really is about Malthus and the Malthusian aspect that was in Darwin. Do you think that was a hook for a lot of eugenic thought, rather than the Abbot or Galton?
Well, I'm saying that the Abbot was critical because you never made much headway. You never really won many converts. You didn't make political headway until you had genetics. And it was the prestige of genetics. And genetics had enormous prestige in the United States because just at that time, America was funding the growth of the land-grant universities. And the land-grant universities included tremendous funding for agriculture, and they had to justify their existence. And genetics offered them a grounds to justify their existence. So America's land-grant universities, which became the hotbeds of eugenics, were trying to find their purpose in life and justify their funding under the federal government and their great growth and their development. And so it took, and genetics, which were then quickly applied to plants and animals, it provided that connection. Now, certainly, it's very good to mention, and I totally agree with the thrust of your question, that Malthus had a tremendous impact on Darwin. I mean, Darwin had converted to the idea of common descent from his reflections on his discoveries on the Galapagos. But he had no idea how it operated, and his insight he attributes, and I believe him, to his reflections on Malthus of the idea of natural selection. Of course, the idea of evolution had been around before. It wasn't new with Darwin. Darwin had been sort of fighting in his own mind since he'd been a student up in Scotland, where those ideas were widely discussed. So the idea of natural selection, which he came to at the same time, and by the same means as Wallace, who had also was thinking on on those same grounds. So certainly, but I view Malthus as part of the background noise that was going on, the intellectual ideas that made the whole idea of evolution and the whole idea of selectionism powerful and compelling. But so did the rise of capitalism, which, of course, Darwin's father was very involved with. He was a very eager capitalist, as was Darwin. He was an investor himself. And so we're talking about an environment that is certainly a background idea. And you can read the literature of what they're writing, and they're saying, well, if we're going to care for before these people, this is the way they perceive it when they wrote. Before these people were out in the countryside and the government wasn't taking care of them, they just die off. And now we're providing poor laws and we're providing asylums and we're helping these people and we have all these public health measures and we're standing in the way of the natural operations of Malthus's laws. And therefore, the humane approach is not to kill these people off, or not to let them die, but take care of them, but sterilize them. Now, that's what they were saying. And so I believe them. That's what they were thinking. Not Darwin, but the people who were reading Galton in the late 1890s and just around the turn of the century. That's the world they were. So yes, it was very much Malthus was very important in providing this sense of what they were trying to do, and that's how they viewed themselves as liberal and progressive, with seeking this approach. Now, but when you break it down that way, really Darwin himself is not essential. They would talk about Galton, they would talk about Malthus, but Darwinism and the idea of this Darwinism was not so essential. And as long as Darwin held to, or if you were an evolutionist, held to soft heredity, or if you held to that is the inheritance of acquired characteristics, you end up turning it and says, well, then people can give them a better environment, and they can sort of correct themselves. And you'll see people whose work was later, like in Dugdale in America, whose work became very important in his work on the Jukes, was very important later for eugenicists in America as evidence. If you go back and read what these people were writing when they collected it, who were Neo-Lamarckian, which was the dominant theory of evolution in America in the before 1900, the dominant theory of evolution, I would contend, in America. Certainly there were a lot of people who were theistic evolutionists, but there was a tremendous strain of and orthogenicists. But Lamarckianism, Neo-Lamarckianism, people, well, as Professor Numbers said yesterday, the most influential of the evolutionists in America, he described as Joseph LeConte, and I would say Joseph LeConte would be a Neo-Lamarckian, as would be many of the other people he mentioned of the late 1800s. And so with them, it wasn't so critical because you could go in and try. It'd be quicker, of course, to sterilize them, but you could go in and actually build institutions. And if you were liberal-minded, you try to change their environment and therefore allow them to change. Now, that didn't mean that no Neo-Lamarckians supported eugenics. Some certainly did. But in general, Neo-Lamarckians never found it as pressing as somebody with a hard heredity. And since Darwin never went that way, evolution wouldn't lead you until after Mendelianism took over. Evolution alone wouldn't lead you that way. It'd certainly be, background noise that could be used as supportive, but it wouldn't be a causal link. And it would be the same. The same idea of blending. If you had a blending of inheritance, which Galton had, if you read Galton's earlier works, he is consumed, as is Teddy Roosevelt, who was mentioned yesterday, as is so many of those people. They were consumed not with sterilization. They were consumed with trying to keep superior families up, because they thought with blending of inheritance, your danger was the superior people are going to fall back in to be the middle. And so what you'd want to do is encouraging breeding by the fit. You wouldn't be too concerned about stopping breeding by the unfit, because by breeding, they're going to be pulled to the special norm as well. So it's those two changes which Darwin didn't have, because Darwin maintained blending inheritance and an inheritance of acquired characteristics. So it's a helpful background It's part of it, but it doesn't. I don't see it caused by Darwinism. I'm saying Darwinism being a reaction to it. And it was the way people were thinking then, but it took those changes because people were repulsed with the idea. People believe, especially in America, but I think in England too, as much so in England, people cared about individual freedom. That's what Josiah Wedgwood was activating him. Americans cared about individual freedom. And taking away a person's power to reproduce is a huge bit of freedom to take away. So you're going to have to be pretty convinced before you're going to get it through. And it took that added evidence. It doesn't mean that nobody didn't believe in it, but to get it to be public policy, it took the added effort, because you just don't see it happening before, except rogue administrators of asylums here and there.
Right, so we've got a few questions in the queue. Here first and then moving up to them.
So perhaps just to connect with Ron's talk yesterday about social Darwinism, and I think, if I recall right, Ron mentioned the eugenics movement briefly. So let's just agree that the label is anachronistic, but we could maybe still talk about the value set that was supposed to go with social Darwinism. So the notion of evolutionary progress, the connection with laissez-faire capitalism, and perhaps some things like imperialism. And so are those value sets found among the eugenicists? Mueller would seem to be at least an exception because he's communist. Or don't we find them characteristically there at all?
As Ron said yesterday, eugenicists were all over the lot. You really can't characterize them fairly. The more you study them, the more you realize they had every ideology you could imagine. There were socialists, there were communist eugenicists, there were radical right-wing conservative eugenicists, there were middle-of-the-road eugenicists. You can see with U.S. presidents. The biggest eugenicists were U.S. presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Calvin Coolidge. Now think of three presidents who had more different. You go from a left to the middle to the right, and they were profound and committed eugenicists, all three of them. Margaret Sanger was a leading eugenicist, but you can go to these, a whole litany of right wing. You can have creationists. One of the leaders of the anti-evolution movement, the fellow from New York, John Roach Stratton, a leader of the anti-evolution movement. He was a eugenicist. So, because you don't need to believe in evolution, you just need to believe in genetics. And you can believe in genetics and not believe in evolution. You can be a young Earth creationist and believe in genetics. So you don't. John Roach Stratton was I believe not a young Earth creationist. I think he was an old Earth creationist. But the point being that they're all over the lot, the people who adopt eugenics. And so it seems, since they have such a wide variety of viewpoints, and since it doesn't stem directly in any of them from evolution, as my original chart showed, it wasn't even portrayed by them as one of the roots. That's why I put that tree up at the beginning. It instead was viewed as their identity. So once you became a eugenicist, Darwinian evolution, you saw Darwinian evolution in that light, and it reconfirmed it. But even they didn't. That's why I showed that chart in the beginning. Even they didn't put it as one of their roots. But they did put it as part of their identity. And that's the subtle nuance that I was trying to play out with my 10,000 words, rather than just leave it to the picture.
Right, so we've got two questions here. So perhaps Faye first and then Richard.
Okay. I think, in fact, Richard was first. Okay. Despite the distinctions that you drew between Charles Darwin and Francis Galton, between soft and hard inheritance, distinctions that Charles Darwin himself
was very careful to reinforce, particularly towards the end of his life.
He thought Francis Galton was a little bit of a nut and didn't like him around.
Well, I've actually done quite a bit of research on that, and I found it a little more complex than that.
It is more. No, it's complex. No, that's why a little bit of a nut. He didn't like to associate with him very much. He didn't like him in his inner circle. He found him a little bit tedious.
Nevertheless, in transnational cultures of eugenics, Francis Galton and Charles Darwin's theories are generally intertwined. In the international congresses and exhibitions of eugenics, from the first in 1912 to the third at the National History Museum in New York in 1932, Charles Darwin and Francis Galton are twin to the extent that they are represented in image and in text as the joint fathers of eugenics. In this case, twinning Darwin with Galton validates or helps scientifically validates eugenics as a scientific theory. What I'd like to know is how you perceive that in relation to the success of eugenics.
I think that's true, and that's why I go back to this chart that I showed. This was a chart that the eugenicists themselves put forward, and of course they put Darwin in it. They look for any sort of authority. You can also see eugenics sermon contests. The American Eugenics Association funded eugenics sermon contests, and they had a whole bunch of ministers, including very conservative, theologically conservative ministers, contributing sermons to that. And they looked for biblical sources, and so they would go back and point to the emphasis the Gospels put on the pedigree of Jesus, going back through the line of David. And would use many sources to show the Bible supports it. And so when I have studied the enactment of eugenic sterilization legislation in the South, they never mentioned Darwin. They mentioned the Bible all the time because that's who was backing it. And they got unanimous backing from the Baptists in the state legislatures of Alabama, of Georgia, of South Carolina. And once California stops doing their sterilizations, they become so popular. They're so popular in South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia that they quickly move up to the number 2, number 3, and number 4 spots in sterilizations. But there you find religious support and the religious arguments for it. So yes, I certainly agree that when they were in the right places, they certainly appealed to that Darwin supports their ideas. But if they were in other places, it was the Bible that supported their ideas, and it was Christianity and the ministers and the Christian churches in the South. And as I said, most of the legislators in the southern states were Baptist, and they passed strongly with their support. So, I mean, you do find some religious objections, and in states with Catholic, if I went back to my chart, you can, I don't know where it is, my U.S. chart, you'll find that the states where it didn't pass are states with large Catholic populations, like Louisiana. And it was the Catholics that opposed it there. But you never found organized opposition by other Christian groups. And of course, Catholics didn't do so on biblical grounds as much as they used Thomas Aquinas and canon law. And if you read, and that was, it's not that those aren't based on the Bible, but they went back to those approaches rather than the more. So yes, I certainly agree with your point that worldwide they appeal to the authority of Darwin as well as Galton. But they would appeal to whatever they believed in it, and I believe that they believed in it because of genetics.
Part of the problem I have with the argument that you're making here is that it seems to me incredibly anachronistic. That is, Mendel's theory was rediscovered in 1900, but many of the leading figures in the eugenics movement had already embraced eugenics before 1900. Galton, Pearson, Weldon in England, Forel in Switzerland, Plurtz, Schallmeyer, Ruden, Tilla, I could go on, in Germany. These guys had already embraced it long before Mendel
as they embraced hard heredity.
Yeah, Weissman, who developed the theories of hard heredity, his theory was called NeoDarwinism.
That's what I said.
What the debates over hard heredity were about Darwinism.
Right.
And so when Plurtz then when Plurtz then develops his thing.
You're agreeing with everything I said. That's why it was NeoDarwinism. That's why it wasn't Darwinism. That was NeoDarwinism, because it had hard heredity. That's my whole point. And they came over it. That's what I was trying to argue through the whole paper, that it was the shift to hard heredity that started bringing people over. And then finally, when genetics was discovered, it brought more people on over, and it gave them enough force to get legislation passed in the United States.
But it doesn't take Mendel, and many of these figures, the people I just named, did see Darwinism as being an incredible force on them. Every one of those would name Darwinism as an important formative influence on their thinking.
That's why I concluded that it took both an English agnostic, Francis Galton, who was hard heredity, and the rediscovery of works of an Austrian abbot, which was getting rid of blending. Those were the two things that were needed. And absolutely. But it came from all those people you mentioned. It was a shift to hard heredity, which Darwin didn't have.
Although I'll still take issue with that as well. For one thing, Darwin did make positive comments about Galton's views about hard heredity in The Descent of Man, also in correspondence to Galton. But also, people like Ernst Haeckel also believed in Lamarckism, but they were one of the first supporters of eugenics, 1870. In the Natural History of Creation, he believed in Lamarckism, but he also believed in hard heredity. So did Ludwig Büchner, so did a lot of other people as well. So. Which
was the reason why I said in my talk that it wasn't that nobody, no neo-Lamarckians, some neo-Lamarckians did, and Haeckel is a great example. When I write longer, I talk specifically, the footnote talks explicitly about people like Haeckel. So there were neo-Lamarckians who did buy into eugenics. But it wasn't the norm for neo-Lamarckians. And with somebody like Ernst Haeckel, you can find quite a few other factors in his own monist views that would incline him that way as well. So you can be a eugenicist and believe in soft heredity and be a neo-Lamarckian, but people instinctively had problems with sterilizing people. And to overcome that opposition, to get a law passed, you needed more. And when you look at the level of the opposition to eugenics before in America and after genetics, before and after Mendel's laws become normed, it's a sea change. Because if you truly believe in Mendel's laws and you believe that they can be applied as straightforwardly to humans as they are to pea plants. And that's what these people came to believe. That mental retardation, epilepsy, whole schizophrenia, a whole variety of other things were just like the tall and the short pea plant. And were inherited as straightforwardly as that. One factor sort of genetic approach. That's what so persuaded people and was so compelling. And that's what you see in the debates, in the public debates. And that's what brings so many of these, this uniform support from the genetics community. And when faced with that, the only people who could stand up for it, you can find only a few people who really, you find some people who just say that's just not the way we should do things, like Wedgwood. But the people who have the courage to really stand up, you have some coming from a strong religious beliefs like the Catholic Church. And you have also some coming from a strong libertarian belief, which partly explains Wedgwood, but explains the opposition of a variety of civil libertarians in the United States, like the ACLU and Clarence Darrow. But you have to be coming from, you have to stand up against this scientific evidence if you really think about it, to not be uncomfortable with it, and to think it's just sort of unseemly. A lot of people did that. But when you have to really face it, it seems like the only two that would really stand up to it are the people who had strong libertarian beliefs or the people who had strong religious beliefs.
Right, we've got time for one last question. So if you could keep the question brief and the response concise, that'd be good. Right up the back.
This is a bit of a different direction. You mentioned that after World War II that this kind of these ideas had lost credibility. It seems to me that we're only just beginning to really wrestle with this tiger, with somatic engineering, germline engineering. Could you say something a little bit maybe about the new wrestlings in the legal community and the ethics community about things like a genetic bill of rights and geneticists now being able to selectively experiment on blastocysts?
Well, you of course make a very good point, and I was focusing on the earlier form of eugenics, and even it's a little more complex story than its demise is a little more complex story than I told it. Of course, it hung on longer in some places. Sweden and places like that kept their laws active longer. In the United States, they really remained active until the mid-'60s in some places, which is a long time after the Second World War. So it's not so simple. And then you do read some of the views of the leaders in the Human Genome Project, especially in early phases of it, would when they were being a little too candid, would talk about a new eugenics. And so you can find that in Jim Watson. You can find that in Francis Crick, just to stick with the Watson-Crick and have a Briton and American. You can find it in Francis Collins, the later head of the Human Genome Project. You can, if you look around, several others. You can talk Shinsheimer. Robert Shinsheimer, you can hear him talking about a new eugenics, and you can read at times Jim Watson, to use an example, a simple example, would almost be as blunt as R.I. Fisher would be, or Bill Hamilton. Bill Hamilton would, my gosh, he could barely keep his mouth shut. And they really believed at first that the Human Genome Project and the pushing for it had the potential of the same sort of dreams that Galton had. Galton went around England, and famously made a beauty map of England, and he thought the prettiest women were those who you should mate before, because men were the it's like in the South, your daddy's rich and your mother's good looking. It was ideal in the South. Here, for him it was your daddy's smart and your mother's good looking, and he had a beauty map of England, and he found the most showing his own English biases. And he showed London had the most beautiful women and Aberdeen the worst. Was his conclusion. And he tried, it was sort of a sightseeing trip, I suppose, where you could, go on dating trips. But you see that in R.I. Fisher, and you see that in Jim Watson. And Jim Watson talked about, who can we complain if all of our children if all of our women are beautiful? Wouldn't that be wonderful? And that was he viewed as one of his goals. He said it was goal, and I think he was pretty honest about things. And Bill Hamilton would say similar sorts of things. Francis Collins would talk about wiping out whole types of genetic defects through using these processes. But what happened to them, to their surprise, is when they got done mapping the human genome, their tone began to change. Oh, nothing could shut up Jim Watson. But their tone would begin to change because they found out there were only 10,000 genes. And they thought they were going to find there were, hundreds of thousands of genes, and active genes. And there was no way you could map the number of traits and behaviors onto these few number of genes. There were way too many behaviors and traits to count with genes. So that ended up reinforcing the notion that our behaviors and our abilities and so many of these human traits, not maybe eye color, but none of these eugenicists ever colored about eye color. They were mostly focused on intelligence, but they would focus on a few other issues. That these were so complex that you couldn't even use the Human Genome Project to pick and select your traits by going in there and pulling a gene out or putting a gene in. It wasn't so simple. So that has really, and now, of course, there's so much more thinking about how the manifestation of these genes is impacted by developmental processes, almost a neo-Lamarckian feedback loop that's coming back into thinking about science. And so it turns out that this work has shown that, and I'm not saying there's nobody who's still dreaming the eugenic dream. I would agree with you. It certainly seemed to be part of the impetus behind some people moving toward the Human Genome Project and that whole effort. But it seems more remote now, at least to me, looking at their works, and to many of them, if you talk to them. If you talk to young geneticists, they don't think like that. If you talk to the geneticists who went into the field in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they did dream some of them dreamed Galton's dream. I don't think, when I talk around at universities and when I talk to young students, they don't think quite that way anymore. And and that's one blessing of increased research and knowledge, so that we can learn both our potential of science, but also the limits of science. And it's important to realize those, because what was it? Isn't it the biblical story that Lucifer fell through? The humans fell through a questing of knowledge, and so knowledge can do a lot of damage. A little knowledge can do a lot of damage and can lead to a lot of hubris. And I think many of the eugenicists and early geneticists had quite a bit of hubris for their field. I find, as we learn more, that we learn that the science itself can be self-correcting. Thank you.
Folks, please do. Well, thanks, Ed, for a fascinating and sobering talk, actually. I'm just going to get Mike up to make a couple of announcements, and then we'll have a break before lunch, which is at 1.
Yeah, we have an interesting evolution of morality issue coming up. 9 more people ate a meal last night than had paid for it. It was quite fortunate that the college was able to react and everybody did get fed. But just to sort of make it clear, the only people who have an evening meal are those who are resident in the college, or those who have specifically paid for a meal for the evening. You'd have had to have booked for it separately. Everybody gets lunch. Everybody gets refreshments.